Everyone, last time we were taking a look at the rise of the Dutch Republic. I wanted to take time just briefly here to take a look at the art in the area to show you how these ideas are influencing art as they're bringing the Baroque into the Netherlands and becoming this kind of major economic and cultural center. But I want to divide them between what's happening in Flanders and what's happening in Holland, because the art's going to be very different. The main artist in Flanders is Rubens, and you're going to see a lot of Rubens. If you go to Europe and go to the art museums, there's going to be a lot of Rubens. He was heavily commissioned and has a lot of art. He has a huge studio, a lot of artists working for him, and so he does a lot of works, and so there's going to be a lot of works in his throughout the museums. Now, what I'm going to just kind of tell you briefly here is I have slightly vid angel a lot of Rubens. I don't want you to go into a museum and say, Brother Osted, why didn't you tell me about all the butts? there's a lot of butts in Rubens' paintings, and I'm going to try to spare you from that. But I want to take a look at some of the major ideas that he has, and you can kind of experience that for yourself when you go to European museums. I mean, Rubens is great. I love him as an artist, but sometimes it's a bit much. But his father fled Flanders during the Spanish reign. And so his father comes from Flanders, this kind of region down here, and he flees to Germany. But the family returns. He mainly left to Germany to escape the persecution from Philip II, right, the king of Spain. And so they're in here. They're constantly getting persecuted by Spain, and so he leaves. He goes to Germany. But they finally return to Flanders when Rubens is 10 years old. He became a local painter for the Guild of St. Luke and traveled to Italy in 1599. And again, we talked about Caravaggio, and that's about when Caravaggio is really hitting the scene and becoming more profound and finding his style. He stays in Italy for 10 years, studies in Florence and Rome and Mantua and Genoa, and so he goes to all the major places of the Italian Renaissance. And he learns of these the great artists, but he's also learning from Caravaggio's style and this kind of changing guard. He became very familiar, and he liked the ideas of Caravaggio and took these ideas back to Flanders with him when he returns in 1609. By the time his family came back, though, Flanders is still recovering from, we talked about the sack of Antwerp. Right, so this is where his family was from. They're still kind of reeling from that sack. It was so devastating. So as they're still kind of struggling from that attack and becoming part of the front lines of the Dutch fight for independence against Spain, I want you to think about how we see these ideas as a backdrop for his works, right? I'd like you to consider how we see some of those tensions, these kind of political tensions, subtly within his work. Because we can't kind of just ignore that and just think, well, he's able to completely tune all those things out. They're going to be, in part, something that shapes the way he sees his work. Now, we can't just interpret all of his works as a conflict between Spain, but there's some of that might be there, some of that kind of conflict and search for independence. But I also want you to think about how we see the ideas, kind of these Catholic ideas. And so Flanders was predominantly Catholic. And so we're going to see just kind of this divide between the South Catholic, North Calvinist. And so this is going to be a big difference between them. So we're taking a look at this region, this Catholic region, for this particular lecture, right? This particular image is one of the first works he completes when he returns to Antwerp from Rome. And we can see the immediate influence of Caravaggio, right? We see the violence of the image, the motion of the characters, the drama, right? So this dark and this tenebrism that we see here that has this dramatic theatrical lighting here. This is the beheading of John the Baptist, and we see the head on the plate. Interestingly, the servant takes the tip of the tongue, and is like, "This is that lying tongue that offended you," right? So kind of showing Salome, and then we see the executioner kind of brutally stepping on his back and lopping off the head, which is still, kind of gross, but having the blood coming out, and now he's kind of sheathing his sword again, and we just see these other kind of soldiers that are off in the distance. But we can see some of those ideas of Caravaggio that are being influenced, right? The same kind of style that's being represented within Caravaggio's work, right? So we've talked about this idea of depicting very human elements to very extraordinary ideas, right? So the human element of a kind of this, innocent woman that just goes in and tries to save her people, right? Or St. Matthew, who has his own kind of struggles of, do you mean me? Am I really supposed to be the one that follows Christ? Am I really supposed to be an apostle? And then we see him kind of laying helplessly on the ground before the executioner who's going to kill him. And then this angel here is reaching down with a reed to pull him into heaven. And so the idea of representing these very intense but tender moments about people willing to sacrifice themselves and become heroes within Christianity, or within, here more specifically, within Catholicism, right? So this is the idea of being sacrificed, or sacrificing oneself for the greater good of, Catholicism. But we also can't help but to think about the violence of this particular moment and some of the frustrations that Rubens might be feeling, being oppressed by the Spanish king. We can't help but to feel some of those frustrations of Antwerp being completely sacked and completely raided by Philip's rogue soldiers. I want to take a look at this one. This one's an altarpiece, and this was one of his first major commissions when he returns in 1609. Again, we're not going to see altarpieces in the north, in Holland, because that is Calvinist and they don't have altarpieces. But since Flanders is Catholic, the church there is still paying for art. And so there's still a major patron. And so we're going to see a lot more religious images coming out of Flanders than we're going to see in the north, right? And so it's just something to think about, some kind of interesting ideas. And so again, this is these kinds of works that are put in Catholic cathedrals are meant to stem the tide of Protestantism, right? These are part of the Counter-Reformation. And just kind of think about, I want you to think about as we examine Rubens' work, how he might be influenced by other artists, right? So another artist that came probably just a few hours away was Grunewald. And we talked about Grunewald's Isenheim altarpiece, right? It's not that far from where he is. He's familiar with these ideas. But what's interesting about the elevation of the cross by Rubens is generally within a triptych, right? And a triptych just means that there are three panels, right? So these panels kind of swing open, right? We've seen this before with a triptych. But what's interesting about Rubens is he has the same theme throughout all of them. So it's like a continued scene where these are three separate scenes having maybe a similar theme, sort of, right? But this is the same scene through all three panels, which is something quite unique. The center panel, we see the dynamic movement of Christ being lifted on the cross. This is a work in motion demonstrating this kind of vibrant energy. The Roman soldiers, they struggle to kind of pick up Christ on the cross. That makes them feel like they're almost going to fall over, that this is kind of their labor to kind of put forth this the death here, this very destructive death in some ways. Yet notice how the men are overly muscular. I mean, they have been working out. They might be having some PDs. I don't know. But we see that they are extremely strong and very similar to the images that we might see in the Last Judgment, right? It's kind of overemphasis on the physical body. And then notice how Christ's body, it kind of juxtaposes theirs by kind of coming diagonally across the picture plane. But this is a subtle commentary, the Catholic Church's declaration on transubstantiation about Christ's blood and body being at the Eucharist. And so this is, again, is their assertion of the importance of the sacraments, right? Here he sheds his blood for the sins of humankind. The left panel shows Mary and John in the back, kind of off in the shadows. They're kind of rising, behind the rising of the cross and out of Christ's eye line, so Christ can't necessarily see them. Christ is looking up, and there was supposed to be, never finished it, but there's supposed to be a panel up here of God the Father. And so this is where Christ was supposed to be looking. I don't necessarily know if it's needed. I think looking up suggests he is looking up to heaven. And so maybe it wasn't necessarily needed, but there was a panel that was going to go up here, and just to give you some of the larger context of it. But the pyramidal composition that we see here is kind of off balance, which is going to be quite common for a lot of Baroque art, that it's going to feel like it's off balance in order to make it feel more dynamic, to make it feel more intense. Let's see, what else do I want to talk about within this one? Things to kind of think about. Over here we see some Roman soldiers putting the two other thieves to death, and then we have some women that are surrounding this just to humanize this even further. This woman kind of recoils here with her child. Another kind of woman is kind of lost in prayer. Notice how the lighting is kind of unique, right? The lighting is coming from this direction, kind of shining on them, giving them this kind of light, this heavenly light from above. Here we see kind of the moon almost in this eclipse, these kind of heavenly phenomenon happening at the same time, these clouds that are circling, and then the heavens kind of part, and the sun is here, demonstrating the light, right? This kind of light that's shining on them, but it's going to be darkened soon with the life of Christ being extinguished, right? But notice the immense emphasis on detail. And this is part of that northern tradition that we've seen before, right? The idea of Van Eyck's Adoration of the Lamb. Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece is probably, I want to say it's about 30 minutes on a train from Ghent to Antwerp. Maybe it was a little bit longer when I took that train. 40 minutes maybe, 40 minutes, an hour at the most. It's not very far. And so he's familiar with these ideas, and we see him kind of integrating that tradition, where we see with Caravaggio a similar kind of style, right, stylistically in terms of the color, in terms of the drama that's happening, but also the amount of detail, right? Caravaggio doesn't give us a lot of detail in the background, right? But what we see here with Rubens is he kind of does. He stays true to that northern tradition with that precise detail of the background. He does foreshorten it a little bit more than Van Eyck, and so there's that blending between Caravaggio and Van Eyck's style as we see that. And then also notice that there's this kind of the sun peeking through part of that northern tradition. We've seen this a little bit with the Grunewald's Isenheim altarpiece, with God looking down on Mary and the events of human history. Amid the storm, there's this kind of light and purpose, kind of that idea that we see. So again, he's blending these ideas to demonstrate the idea that clouds and adversity might happen, but God shines through with light. And so again, thinking about the context of the 80 Years' War and his conflict with Spain, how this might appeal to people, right? Amid the darkness that we have, there's going to be hope. There's going to be kind of relief from the misery, from the pain, right? This is just another early work that we see from Rubens, a similar kind of theme. This is known as the deposition, or the descent from the cross, where they take the dead body of Christ down from the cross. And then we have John and Mary Magdalene. And I'm assuming Joseph of Arimathea is one of these characters. Not really sure which one. Don't quote me on that. But again, we see this kind of the darkness at night, I suppose, or maybe this is kind of the scriptural element of the darkness that comes over the land with the death of Christ. But notice how even though there's darkness that surrounds them, there's this light, right? The body of Christ still has this kind of light, this energy, this hope, this radiance that can lead and direct humanity. But it's represented in a naturalistic way, perhaps Rubens is a little bit more, I guess, I don't know how to say it. He's a little bit more symbolic, I guess, with his lighting, where we see with Caravaggio, this naturalistic lighting is the emphasis, right? The windows up here shining down and Christ off in the shadows. He still has this light on his face and his hands, but this one is much more of an emphasis on that Christ has this symbolic light within him, which is kind of truer to the earlier Mannerist style of Titian and the Pietà. This one's kind of interesting. I like to take a look at each area and how they're representing the fall of man, because I think that helps us to understand how that particular area, that region, perceives themselves. I think as we try to understand Adam and Eve they tend to be a metaphor for who we are and how we come to see the world around us. And so we've taken a look at some other representations of this. We've seen Durr, and Durr kind of takes a look at the fall of Adam and Eve, and he doesn't necessarily depict it in the same kind of harshness that others do, right? With what we see with Michelangelo's expulsion or Masaccio's expulsion, the idea of this extreme human sorrow, godly sorrow, we might say, this kind of suffering of moving away from God, and that kind of remorse for our sins and the desire to receive repentance and forgiveness. Durr sees that much softer, right, which is kind of an interesting thought process. He kind of sees it as maybe a necessity for us to be able to gain knowledge, wisdom, experience, these elements. What we see with Rubens as he represents this particular theme, first of all, what I love about this one is the softer brushstrokes that we see, right? It's kind of this hazy, dreamlike quality to it, this kind of timelessness. We don't see necessarily the extreme dark kind of contrast, the chiaroscuro or tenebristic contrast of a lot of Baroque art. It's just kind of this happier kind of quality to it. But notice what's happening here, right? So we have the serpent here who kind of is half a snake, half a baby. Don't ask me about that. But giving this forbidden fruit, generally represented as an apple for whatever reason. And then Eve is just kind of seemingly kind of caught up in a trance. And she's just kind of naturally moving towards it as though she can't help herself. And Adam gently kind of places his hand on her shoulder to try to stop her and say, but wait, we have been commanded not to, and there's nothing that he can do to stop her, even though he kind of sees more. So again, as we take a look at this, I think that kind of commentary, that subtle commentary, is going to be interesting to see how the Dutch see themselves, and more importantly, how they interact with men and women, right? As we take a look at this, women are going to be this, led seemingly to their destruction. And if men aren't cautious, they're going to follow them, right? And so this kind of idea that women are kind of the destroyers in a sense, that might be kind of strong. And again, it's not me saying that. It's just the commentary, the subtle commentary that we see. And then the men are trying to, stay strong and resolute. And we're going to see that subtly within a lot of art, particularly within Holland, right? So keep that theme. We saw it a little bit with Caravaggio and Judith and Holofernes and Salome and the beheading of John the Baptist. And then we saw it a little bit again with Gentileschi, even though she has a bit of a different spin on that, showing that women might need a little bit more power because they're being, taken advantage of in the world. This one is going to more take a look at a different kind of concept of women as the destroyers, right? This one's kind of interesting as well. This is the four rivers of paradise. The four rivers of paradise are the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Gihon, and the Pishon. And it comes from Genesis chapter 2, verses 10 to 14, which you see there. And these are the rivers that are represented by men and women and the people that inhabit them, right? This is a biblical reference to the world after the Garden of Eden, but it's also a reference to the extension of the powers of the Dutch Republic, that they have now gained this opportunity to fill the globe with their influence, going off to these far-reaching lands for their spices, for their trade, right? So it's kind of an interesting idea. We see alligators and tigers, these exotic animals coming together, and the sailors are coming back and telling stories of these exotic animals, and then artists are kind of inspired by this expanding world of new developments and new kind of species that are out there. We see African women represented here. This painting displays the wealth and power of the Dutch, right? As they're gaining their independence, they're gaining their voice. That we see that this is them suggesting, hey, this is what we have. This is what makes the Dutch great, right? He did this particular work when he was still in Italy, so he doesn't really return until 1609. But he becomes an established portraitist. He paints this for a wealthy family, a Genoese family of bankers. This was probably for her wedding when she was 22. It's 9 feet high, which was quite unique for its day to have such a large portrait, but it gives you the sense of the immaculate detail. This kind of grandeur is typical of the Baroque, but we can also see within this kind of the influence of Jan van Eyck and the details. I mean, you can see each piece of silk thread on her dress, right? We can see the kind of the rouge in her cheeks, right? The kind of the puckered lips. We can even see the light glistening off the pearl earring, right? All of these immaculate details, the highlights in her hair. We can see the delicate folds of the curtain behind her, that kind of velvet kind of feel. So he's painting, even though he's painting with oils, he's painting with this kind of feeling of texture, right? And so that texture really comes across with his detail. I want to take a look just kind of briefly here at the life cycle of Marie de Medici, because these are super interesting. So Marie Medici commissions Rubens to paint her life, right? So Marie Medici is a Medici, right? So we've talked about the Medicis before. But her father was a wealthy Duke of Tuscany, and he marries his daughter off to France. And she marries Henry the Fourth, and she becomes the mother, right? The two of them have a child, and the child is Louis the 13th, right? And so, again, we see the expanding influence and continued influence of the Medicis. What's interesting about that relationship, though, is Henry the Fourth dies fairly young. And so he takes, when he dies, she takes over. And so now we have a Medici that is controlling France. Interestingly enough, I mean, her son, Louis the 13th, is too young to rule. And so she rules kind of with an iron fist. And then when he becomes of age, he's like, okay, Mom, time to abdicate the throne to me, kind of let me take over. And she's like, yeah, I don't think so. And so there was some major tension between them. And eventually he had to overthrow her and banish her from France, right? But before that happens, she commissions Rubens as a famous artist to paint her life. And so she put these paintings, and there's 21 of them. We're not going to go through all 21. I just want to kind of show you a handful. But they're 13 feet by 28 feet wide. I mean, so they're huge, right? And she puts these in the Luxembourg Garden Palace. And so there's a garden at the very center of Paris. It's called Luxembourg Gardens. It's still there to this day. You can walk through it, and there's a palace there that's now just a museum. But it used to be her home that she had specifically built to remind her of Tuscany, right? And so she wanted these to go inside it, which is kind of an interesting commentary that you have paintings of yourself inside your home. And to each his own, I suppose, but it's a little weird for us. But what we see within this particular painting is Rubens blends heaven and earth, history and mythology, right? So it's not necessarily about facts. It's about capturing the emotion of the moment. And this particular one is when Marie Medici, seen here at the center, steps off the boat from Italy and she arrives in France. And so these are her first steps in France. She's stepping on the royal red carpet. We have Athena, and she's gonna be a common theme, wearing the kind of the crest, the golden flowers of France. This kind of element of welcoming in. We have all these other people that are kind of there welcoming her in. We have at the very top here, this is Fame, who flies in, and because one trumpet isn't enough, blowing two trumpets. And then we have down here, this is Poseidon, the god of the sea, kind of whisking her, guiding her to sea. And it's interesting that visually he's seen below her as though he's kind of, I kind of recognize your greatness, as though a god would ever do that. At least a Greek god would ever do that. And then surrounded by these other kind of sea nymphs who are kind of pulling the boat to shore and then tying it to the dock. And so kind of an interesting blending of mythology here, but creating this legend, right? She wants this legend of who she is. This is the destiny of Marie Medici. This is when she was, I guess, conceived, I suppose. This is the thought process back in heaven. This is on Mount Olympus with Juno, who is the goddess of childbirth, but also Marie saw her as a kind of a patron goddess of her, and Zeus seen here. And then these three individuals are the three fates. It's generally thought that one is taking the thread out, the other one is measuring it, and then the other one cuts it. But the scissors here are gone, and so what they're doing is they're weaving the fate of Marie Medici. But because they don't have scissors, it seems as though her fate will not end. She'll just kind of continue on into eternity, that her fame is going to be so great, right? So you can only imagine the amount of ego Marie Medici had, right? And so I don't know if Rubens, was laughing when he was painting these kind of quasi-absurd paintings. But clearly this is kind of propaganda for Marie Medici to be able to demonstrate her power and influence. And maybe part of the problem is that she never really felt that she was, she always felt like she was an outsider coming from Italy into France. And so maybe this was a way to try for her to legitimize her sovereignty or her rule over France. Maybe it was just her own self-doubts. Who knows? But this is the birth of the princess, right? So we have all these gods and goddesses coming down to deliver the baby to her mother. And then over here, we have Poseidon kind of next to the water, next to a jug, just kind of laying out saying, yeah, that's cool. Not really doing a whole lot, but there, right? The idea that the gods and goddesses are present, and it's as though they're giving their stamp of approval to her greatness. And then we have the Medici crest here. And so this is a symbol of her family line. This is her education, the education of a princess. And so it's to suggest that Athena and Hermes and Apollo, the god of music, all coming down to instruct her on knowledge and wisdom. Sorry, where is it? There it is. Knowledge and wisdom surrounded her throughout her birth. And then over here are the three graces, right? The idea of brightness, joyfulness, and bloom, right? Here we see the presentation of her portrait to Henry IV, the King of Spain. So this is kind of, I don't know, this is like the Mutual app, I suppose. Swipe left or right. This is just showing her picture, her portrait, and then him kind of falling in love. And then we have this kind of symbol of, I mean, it could be Athena, I guess, but I think the book calls this is a symbol of France, right? Kind of stepping over and looking on, and then these gods and goddesses kind of coming down, showing it, and then these individuals down here kind of playing with armor. And then we have Zeus with the eagle and lightning bolts, and then Hera with the peacock, right? These are their symbols, looking down as though they are ordaining this event. And then this is her wedding by proxy. So she got married while she was still in Italy before she left to France. She married, who stood in was her uncle, And so they were married even though they never saw each other physically until she arrived. This is just a symbol of that, but happening within the context of a church, demonstrating that not only her greatness in terms of Greek mythology, but also her greatness within, Christianity. And then again, we have her now arriving. And so this is the next painting within that particular cycle. But I want us to think about, how do we see the blending of truth and fiction within this? And how do you think people would feel about these paintings, seeing them? Are they like chuckling? Or are they, being like, wow, she must be really great? Did this kind of propaganda work? Or does this kind of propaganda work? Do you think they saw through it? Or or was it more of kind of the display of, wow, France is great, she's great, so that makes me great? And I just have some couple images that kind of think about some of the absurdity, whether we still see this to this day, right? Here's a couple of images that I found on the internet about Trump, and you can do this with any political leader. They're all out there. But again, they connect Trump to George Washington, holding up the Liberty Bell, and then being, I guess, a superhero, right? Similar ideas that we see here, right? It's a way to kind of make a political leader seem even better. I want to take a look at it with that theme of demonstrating political leaders and how the Baroque era is representing this. I wanted to take a look at one of Rubens's students. This is Anthony van Dyck. At 20, he already showed promise that he was going to become Rubens' most celebrated protege. Right? He traveled to England when he got noticed by Charles I, seen here on the left, who saw his talent. Charles I tried everything he could to keep him in England, paying him a generous salary and even knighting him. Right? So he saw the ability of this, young aspiring artist, and he kept him in England. And so a lot of Van Dyck's paintings are going to be in England. So if you go to England and go to the National Gallery, there's quite a few Van Dycks that are there. Here we see Charles I, the English monarch. He is married to Marie de Medicis and Charles IV's daughter from France. Her name was Henrietta Marie. The problem in their marriage centered around the Protestant background and her Catholic faith. And so England, that we talked about, was become Anglican, but she, coming from the region of Flanders, was Catholic, or coming from France, was Catholic, and so there was that tension between them. Here, Van Dyck kind of deviates from the tradition of equestrian portraits. Generally, equestrian portraits put the king on the horse, but here he is dismounted. He's much more humble and associated with peace rather than war, right? So this is kind of thinking about some of the times of this grandiose. Maybe we need to think beyond the idea of political conquest and just think about the good life, right? Living a good life. Generally, equestrians show the ideas of conquering and conquest. However, this is not that. This is him hunting, right? Which is a pastime. He's not engaged in diplomacy. He's not planning an invasion. He's not even in a church, right? He's just out enjoying life. And so, but even though, right, he's out kind of doing, I don't want to say common themes. These are things of the very wealthy, but kind of ordinary things of the day rather than grandiose things like, I guess, war or kind of religious things. He suggests that he doesn't even need the trappings, right? The virtuous king rules by virtue and not by force, right? Which is very different than what we see kind of an earlier image with Hans Holbein and his Henry VIII, which shows, all of the trappings. He shows the kind of the royal robe of Henry VIII. He shows kind of the sword at the center, all of the jewels, the bling that Henry VIII has, demonstrating this kind of royalty to convey to the audience, to the viewer, how wealthy and important he is. This one is much more subdued, right? I mean, he still has this elaborate silk on. I mean, he's wearing nice clothes, and he does have attendants here who are tending the horse. But it's much more subdued than most royal images, and so it's kind of an interesting connection. What I love most about this, in addition to the silk, I love how the elbow just kind of enters into our space, which is kind of an interesting way to kind of represent that. So just thinking about this idea, this display of wealth and strength, which is very different from what we see with Marie Medici, right? And I want us to think about why that might be. Why is he choosing to have this much more subdued image where Marie Medici just kind of went all out and was very heavy-handed with that. I want to take a look at one more artist coming from Flanders. Jan Bruegel the Elder was the son of Peter Bruegel the Elder. And here we see another portrait that's a display of power and wealth, right? And as we take a look at this, I mean, it doesn't necessarily seem like that. It just seems like a very messy museum. But what it is about the two people in the portrait on the left, right? This is who it's about. These are this is Isabella and Albert Habsburg, coming from the Habsburg royal family. These are the archdukes to the Habsburg dynasty. This is the display of their wealth and their prowess to acquire great art. And so again, what we see with the Baroque era is this idea of people using their wealth and what they're doing, rather than focusing on conquest, they're focusing on becoming great art collectors. They're focusing on culture, right? And with that focus on culture, which in some ways can be this haughty display of pride and grandeur, but in a lot of ways, it's also helping to fund the arts and culture, right? So there's some kind of negative elements to it with the pride element, but there's also some positive elements to it with the cultural developments. But how do we see this kind of wealth and prowess in addition to just all of the elements that are displayed here? It shows their piety with Madonna and Child on the far right. It shows the works of Rubens to demonstrate their taste, right, of what they're able to acquire. It shows the globe and the telescope, right, to show their reach in the world and scientific achievements. Albert was sent to the Netherlands to restore Spain's influence in the Netherlands in 1596, and he served successful military campaigns there, and so he has that wide-reaching influence within the particular region. And so what we see here is just that demonstration of wealth and power, similar to what we see with other works of art, where artists are going to the people with the money and representing them. And what the people with the money want, they want to demonstrate kind of themselves. And so it's interesting to think about how artists are what they're focusing on in terms of their subjects, and what the subjects, the people that are paying for art, want to display. What is it that they want to say about themselves? And so I want you to kind of think about how they're doing this, and maybe which one does it better or much more in a less repulsive sort of way. How are they kind of representing their own message and trying to display their piety, trying to display their wealth, trying to display their influence? So just some thoughts to think about as we think about the Baroque art coming out of Flanders.